Resourcefulness and Rewards, Redefining Technician Engagement. Join passionate automotive trainer and coach Andrew Uglow as he talks about the nuances of balancing management practices with technician resourcefulness for optimal performance. Explore strategies for fostering trust, effective staff retention, and achieving a harmonious workplace where both productivity and employee satisfaction thrive. I'm your co-host, Anthony Perl. This is the Frictionless Workshop podcast. Let's get cranking. Andrew, I want to give the tech perspective here and ask for your interpretation of this. We do all the hard work, we put in all the effort, but we don't get much in return.
Yeah, see, we've got a two-part problem, haven't we? We've got the management side of things and what management does, but we've also got the technician side of things and what technicians do. And I guess the solution for this, and presupposing that people want one, right? Being that if I'm hitting my numbers and I'm getting my targets, why would I change anything? Well, only when it becomes painful enough, generally, do people change. And so ultimately, we need to work on both, right? So we need technicians to move from the why should I when you philosophy, why should I do this when you don't, to a resourceful philosophy. How can I be more resourceful here? And at the same time, we need to create an environment where, for technicians, it's safe to do that and not do the more and more and more like Creedence Clearwater Revival said, oh, that was great. Fantastic, Andrew. You did a cracking job. I couldn't believe that you can do it in that time. Here's another one. Here's another one. Quick, faster. Here's another one. That's not going to work. There needs to be some intelligence around how much is enough to start with. And then to be respectful of people's boundaries, to understand that there are times there are peaks and there are times there are troughs, and it's just the way that is. I think that combination of thinking about our thinking as management and looking at what our beliefs, what our philosophies are, what our underpinning thinking is, and if it's not serving us, if it's actually contributing to, or in some cases is actually the cause of the problems that we're seeing in the workshop, we need to shift that. With respect to the people like Deloitte and KPMG, the benchmarks and the KPIs that they offer generally correct. They're not specifically correct. And maybe your workshop is one of the outliers. Maybe your team is different and you need to respond to what you've got on the ground, right? The map is not the territory. And at the same time, that's great, but you can't just do that. You have to then work with your technicians. You need to have them learn how to be resourceful. And those two parts in parallel is how we end up with a frictionless environment. We've got management practice that supports and serves the technicians, and technicians who know how to be resourceful and want to do a good job and want to do the work that you want them to do to the standard that you want it done at. And so that's where we end up with technician engagement, right? Because we've now got this harmony, this balance between a people-centric philosophy and a money-centric philosophy. Because at the end of the day, if we're not making money, we're not going to be there for much longer. It's a thing. It matters. It's important, but you can't just stop at the money. And I suspect that this has been the unspoken, unwritten, undiagnosed challenge of business.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's easy to think that money is the root cause and is the solution. Sometimes where the money is spent may not actually be on the individuals either. It may be on other things. I mean, we haven't really talked about this, but we've touched on the whole idea in previous episodes about getting to peak performance, whether that's a reality or not. But what about the reward side of things? That's where this comes in as well, is saying, okay, if in relative terms, a peak was achieved, it could be for an individual job, it could be for a day, it might be over a project over a certain period of time. Is there a reward system in place that is sufficiently attuned to what the techs actually want? Because it may not just be lining their pockets.
Right. And I want to ask that question again, and specifically of the technicians or of the managers thinking about their technicians, how much is enough? Daniel Pink in his book talks about taking money off the table. And for the life of me, I cannot recall the book. I probably should Google it. He talks about repetitive work, which can offer 60% plus of a workshop is repetitive work, service and repair. We've changed brakes before, we've drained oil before, we've, done tires, all those things that wear out on a car, that's repetitive work. The Science of Motivation is the name of the book by Daniel Pink. He talks about for those sort of tasks, taking money off the pay, incentivizing those tasks. But for the other tasks, the 40% of their work, we need to take money off the table. We need to pay well enough that money's no longer a problem. And that then opens up performance. And so for the technician's perspective, well, how much is enough? Is it reasonable for a technician to expect, 150K a year? Well, if they're contributing sufficiently, if they're performing sufficiently and they're delivering sufficiently, is it unreasonable to pay them that? And so we get back into this question about balance and until we test, until we come up with effective ways of testing this, we're not going to know. If we don't ask the question, we'll never know. I certainly know in the US, I've met a bunch of different people in my time over there, and I know of technicians that are on $150,000, $200,000 a year, US, but they're working 6 days a week and they're working like 12-hour days. And they really have worked out how to do peak performance. And at the same time, for the technician, well, it's worth it. It's absolutely worth it. But you talk to these people and they go, I know I can't pull this off for 10 years. This is like a 5-year project. And so thinking about that then, and they have a different methodology. They have flat rate and a few other bits and pieces that we don't take here in Australia. But if I've got a technician that's delivering sufficient value, well, wouldn't it be worth paying them? And flipping that on its head and going, well, what if I lose them? What's that going to cost me? And how much of that cost am I prepared to contribute to keeping them? Like, is it, look, it's the age old question. Is it worth spending 10 grand to save 20? Well, yeah.
The Frictionless Workshop podcast is brought to you by Solutions Culture. For details on how to get in touch with Andrew, consult the show notes below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Now, back to the podcast. Yeah, it is, isn't it? And that's an important idea that needs to be understood, because it's also, I suppose, is really quantifying that value, because it's easy to think that people are replaceable. And it might be that you might recognize in the industry that it may take a little longer than, just replacing someone to wait tables to get to find someone to fill the job. But you've still got to then quantify how good someone was at their job and how much they learned how to work in your environment and get the best out of it, versus having to find someone else to see whether they actually are up to that standard and how long it'll train them to get to that level that someone else was at. That cost is significant.
Yeah. We went and measured this. I went and partnered with a couple of HR people who are experienced in the field and did the test, right? Is it really what they tell us? Like, is all of this actually true about what they say? Cost of staff turn, et cetera, et cetera. And the long and short of it is it's actually worse than we thought. KPMG back in 2021, I think it was, or 22, released a report, and they said that the average metropolitan dealership spends about $1 million a year on staff turn. Now that's across all of their departments. That's sales, service, parts, used car, like the car wash dude, everything. Now that's $1 million off their bottom line just on staff turn. And I go, well, is it worth spending $200,000 to save your $1 million? Yeah. Is it worth spending $500,000 to save your $1 million? Yeah. Yeah, it is. And so underpinning this idea of staff turn And the cost of staff turn, and again, if you just have someone who is semi-skilled, it'll cost pretty much their wage, their annual wage to replace them. If you've got someone highly skilled, like a foreman or something like that, it's like 2.5 times their wage. It's just what you'll lose when you lose them. And that's coming straight off your bottom line. But we don't measure that. We don't have a metric in place for that. This is one of my frustrations. We don't have a way to be able to quantify that. We don't have a line item in our budget on our spreadsheet for here's what I lost because I lost staff. And I would offer that really good management, and certainly this is a thing for HR, they track staff turn. They're like, not just who, but how many, which department, all that sort of stuff. Certainly in major corporations, if they're any good, if they've got any sort of culture that people want to be part of, they are tracking staff turn. And they track it down to type, to managers, to departments, to all sorts of stuff. There's a variety of different things. I would offer that good dealerships do this as well. If I'm seeing a whole bunch of a particular type of person leave, well, why is that? And there could be a really good reason, or there might be a real problem. But until you track it, you don't know, right? What gets measured gets managed. And it's interesting that Einstein made the statement. He said, not everything worth measuring can be measured. And not everything that is measured is worth measuring. And I would offer that actually measuring and tracking, not just the staff turn, but what it costs you, like to go and put that in. And there's some really good resources on the internet about how to work out what that is, but actually put that into your budget as a thing. This is how much I lost as a result of my staff turn. And then we'll go, well, why is that? Go and test for why that is. Because if you don't test, how do you know? Should we measure speed? Yeah, absolutely. Efficiency. Should we measure accuracy, which is fixed first visit? Yeah, absolutely. You should measure that. Satisfaction? Well, yeah, definitely. Is that customer satisfaction we should measure? Is that dealer principal satisfaction should measure? Is that business owner satisfaction? Technician satisfaction? Like whose satisfaction should we measure? Well, maybe the question is all of them. Should we be measuring profit and cash flow and gross profit and labor and costs and time? And absolutely, we should be measuring all of those things without question. And at the same time, understand that there's limits. There is limits to peak performance. Sometimes those limits are organic, as in this particular person, this particular team, this is just what they're capable of. Strangely enough, not everyone's Superman. Who knew? And sometimes those limits are non-organic, like these senior technicians. They've just said, sorry, no, I know you'll exploit me. And if that's a thing, well, you've got to go back and look at trust. That's bad for business. If senior people in your business don't trust management or don't trust some of the management, that's that is a flashing, glowing warning light. Like that's a big deal. That's not a little thing to worry about. That's huge.
Yeah, and trust is such an important element. And it is often completely overlooked when you're talking about measuring this sort of idea.
Like Einstein said, not everything that needs to be measured can be measured. How do you measure trust?
Yeah. And it's almost, there's a yes or no answer to it really, isn't it, when it comes to trust? Because if you're somewhere in the middle, you're not sure, then I would argue that it's a no.
Yeah.
So realistically, you either trust or you don't. And the minute that you've lost, we've talked in previous episodes about football analogies, and they often talk about when the coach loses the room. And it's the same idea, isn't it? And it starts with one person's perspective, and then they share it with a few other people, and suddenly everyone's attuned to something, whether it's real or not. But if you don't cut it off at very early stages and trust is lost, you're in a very difficult position.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? There seems to be what's the word I'm looking for? And culturally too, like this isn't just in business. I see this everywhere. And again, I go back to Stephen Covey's book, The Speed of Trust. If you don't have trust, you cannot have enough rules and regulations. You just can't. Look at how government runs. Prosecution rests your honor. What a classic example of not having enough rules and regulations. But the bit that spins me out, that really sort of knocks me for six, is that people demand trust. And it's like, well, no, that's not how it works. Trust is given. Trust is earned. You need to be trustworthy for people to trust you. You can't just go, well, I want everyone to trust me. Well, great. Worthwhile striving for that. But to do that, you need to be trustworthy. And there are behaviors that are trustworthy and there are behaviors that are not trustworthy. And those behaviors will come from your beliefs, from your management philosophy. And it's the same for technicians. If you want to get paid more, well, you've got to contribute more. This is not rocket science. You don't need to have a PhD in physics to figure this out. This is what it is.
And but the thing about trust as well is it's about setting expectations and maintaining it, because what goes alongside of trust is safety. And the minute you break that feeling of safety is when the trust falls away. And I suppose, to use the automotive example, if someone drives their car into the workshop and they take a quick look and say, yes, it just needs an oil change and a few basics, and that'll be, $300. And then suddenly there's a phone call later saying, oh, look, we've had to replace the whole engine, so that's $5,000. Like, you've lost someone. The safety net is gone. The trust is gone, and you don't want that happening.
Oh, absolutely. How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? There's a book, Dale Carnegie.
Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it, how some things seem to be timeless and other things just seem to be left behind in time. But it's all the difference in the world. And this is why customers come back, isn't it? We talk about customer retention. Customers come back because they trust you. They know that you're not going to screw them over. Your service advisors trust that you're not going to stitch them up. Your technicians know that it's safe to go and overperform when the need arises, because they know that you're not going to expect it on the very next job.
Thank you for listening to the Frictionless Workshop podcast. For details on how to get Andrew working with you and your technicians, take a look at the show notes. There's also a link to some special content you can access. I'm Anthony Perl, reminding you to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.